Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Here I am in front of St Mary the Virgin Church in Putney. So this church dates back to the Middle Ages. You can see the medieval campanile, complete with a belfry up high, and then you can see this 19th century extension to it. Not so neatly done. You can obviously tell it's from a later era, but it's very hard to do it in a way which is in keeping with the original Norman style. The Putney Church here is best known for the Putney Debates, which began in October 1647 and lasted for a fortnight into November of that year. So the English Civil War, the first English Civil War, had just finished. King Charles I and his royalists had been defeated by the parliamentarians. And by that stage, Oliver Cromwell, Old Ironsides as he was known, had emerged as perhaps the most prominent leader on the parliamentary side. He was a very dashing and gifted cavalry commander. So Putney was a village several miles west of London, south of the River Thames. So it was considered to be in the county of Surrey, not part of London at all in those days. What else about Putney? Well, anyway, it was a centre of Presbyterianism, as in people who thought that perhaps they should copy the Scots, and that the ordinary churchgoers should elect elders to represent them, and that should govern the church, and all the rest of it. Anyway, at the Putney Debates, it was a Council General of the Army, and ordinary soldiers as elected representatives, and they debated what the political setup should be for England thereafter, possibly extending it to Wales, Scotland and Ireland. And so there was a group called the Levellers, a radical group popular amongst the ordinary soldiers in the army and amongst some civilians too. And they said that every man who was not a servant and indeed not a Catholic and had not fought for the king in the late war ought to have the franchise. That means the right to vote. So notice anti-Catholicism was widespread and severe in England at the time. There was a tiny Catholic minority in England. So that was that, and that obviously not only the Church of England should exist, the other Protestant churches, the Baptists and the Quakers, that's the Religious Society of Friends, ought not be discriminated against by law. And as one radical said, he who is the poorest has as much a right to a life as he who is the richest, something along those lines. Then Ireton, who was one of Cromwell's cronies and indeed Cromwell's son-in-law, said that someone who doesn't have a fixed interest in the country shouldn't have a vote. An interest meant really property, real property. So owning land, farmland. Remember, in the 17th century, a high majority of people were still farmers. Even in London, on the edge of London, some people were going into the countryside to work on farms. So it's hard to remember just how agricultural it was. And land was the resource to own. There were hardly any factories. There were a few coal mines that were very low tech in those days. Not many other businesses, a few shops. There were some ships, there were some merchants who made money, but really it was still a mainly agricultural country like everywhere else in the world. And there was a faction with the parliamentary army called the Grandees. Cromwell, Ireton, the Earl of Manchester and several others, and they were major landowners. Cromwell actually hadn't owned that much land before the Civil War. Indeed, at one stage he'd been reduced to ploughing his own fields, and he'd considered emigrating to America. But anyway, the Grandees, they had captured the king, imprisoned him at Hampton Court, and their first response was not to kill the king or keep him in prison forever, simply to negotiate. Monarchism was that strong. It was very hard to conceive of a country without a monarch, as that every country in the world was a kingdom, just about, bar a few tiny republics in Italy, San Marino, places like that. So you had to look back centuries before a large country had been a republic. But anyway, then the king escaped the start of the Second Civil War, gathered some of his supporters, and that was a reason to shut down the debates. But the Grandees had felt very menaced by these Putney Debates in this church here, because they thought that these radical Nostra were gaining traction amongst ordinary soldiers. Perhaps only 30% of people could read and write in those days, often to a very low level, write their name and nothing else. More men than women could write, because people didn't consider it worth sending girls to school. So people were not politically conscious in most cases. This war was a very political war. It had raised people's political awareness, because previous wars have been dynastic ones. House of Lancaster, House of York, and that really made no difference to the ordinary courtier it's not going to change anything. No quality of life differences, and there are no really policy differences between them. It's just who's going to have the throne. But this one was about political questions. Did the king have the ultimate authority? Was the law something above the king? And then it touched religious affairs as well. Charles I was an Anglican, a high Anglican, believed in Arminianism, worshipped the Lord in the beauty of holiness. He was an Anglican, so he's head of the Church of England, but he seemed to worship in a Catholic style, which some people thought was suspiciously close to bringing the country back to Roman Catholicism. Don't forget his queen, Henrietta Maria, had come from France, and she was a Roman Catholic, of course, and people said Charles I's children will be brought up Catholics, he'll bring back Catholicism. It didn't happen. So there was this paranoia of Catholicism, and many people detested Catholicism. Anyway, the Putney debates were shut down. King Charles I was defeated again in 1648 and put on trial. He stood trial in Westminster Hall in January 1649. His trial just lasted a few days, and then he was sentenced to death by having his head smitten from his body. And indeed, he was done to death outside the banqueting house on Whitehall. The banqueting house still stands. But the Putney debates presented a fascinating turning point in history where English history did not turn. That radical group, the Levellers, had wanted something approximating to democracy, though they didn't use that word. But even they didn't want the vote for all men. A servant was not permitted to vote, probably defined as anybody who drew a salary. It was not a self-employed farmer or something of that nature. And they were still wanting to discriminate against the Catholic minority. And they were obviously going to penalise those who'd been royalists in the Civil War, though in time that may have changed. A group split off the Levellers, and they were called True Levellers, or Diggers, led by Gerard Winstanley. And they went a stage further, and they seemed to be primitive communists, so they didn't use the word that, communism, but they wanted to seize property from the very wealthy and share it out amongst those who were penurious. And most people would live in what we now recognise as poverty. Many people were malnourished. Many children were going out around without shoes, even in the winter, and say that nobody should own more than he can actually use. One house each and not too big, otherwise more than one family has to live there. And no more farmland than you could actually farm yourself. You must do the work yourself. It's wrong that many people are landless labourers and they're enriching the people who are already filthy rich. So there have been some Leveller mutinies, partly because the army pay was in arrears. There have been 5 years of destruction. More people were killed proportionally in the English Civil War than in the First World War in this country. So the economy would almost ground to a halt. And that was another reason why Cromwell said, let's go to Ireland, the last royalist stronghold, and we'll finish off the royalists there. And in Ireland, most of us being Catholics thought, well, Charles I is not too bad. He's not discriminating against the Catholics, so we will back him up. And Cromwell defeated us in 1649. And so to his soldiers who hadn't been able to receive money for a long time, he said, all right, I will give you land off the royalists in Ireland. And that's how many Protestant settlers came to live in Ireland in the 17th century. So the grandees within the parliamentary side, those who came from wealthy landowning backgrounds, they were the officers, and they had some support amongst ordinary men, because Radical Nostra are not believed by everybody. Some people are just apolitical, don't understand these things, are inarticulate, are just dim sometimes, don't care, just obey orders, don't even think about it. There were some Leveller mutinies that were put down at Burford and Woodstock, and some of the Leveller mutineers were executed by firing squad up there. So Cromwell moved swiftly to deal with their legitimate grievances and pay them off, as I explained, obviously confiscating property from royalists in this country as well. And there's a commemoration every year at Burford, that's in North Oxfordshire, for the Levellers who were done to death for mutinying against Cromwell. And every May there's a commemoration ceremony for them and a day of celebration. And who was the guest of honour to speak at that event way back in about 2000? It was Jeremy Corbyn MP, now a leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. So how things have come full circle. Well, that's the Putney debates, a scintillating little episode. And even some women approached Parliament at this time, saying that women ought to be permitted to vote. And into the 16th century, a handful of women had been allowed to vote, because the right to vote was linked to owning property. And there were some women who owned substantial property, and they were permitted to vote if they were unmarried, either spinsters or widows. But this right was deprived of them in the 17th century. The Parliament wrote back to these women saying, meddle with your housewifery. that they felt that women were impudent to ask to have any political voice, and the issue was not broached again for over 200 years. Because the medieval legislation would use the word men, but in Latin men could be interpreted to mean people, not just male persons. So in that sense, women were not specifically excluded from the right to vote at the time. That's the Putney debates, which was a scintillating little episode. Do go into this church, and there's a fascinating display about it. That's all from Putney, which stands hard by the Thames. There's Putney Bridge. Didn't exist at the time of the Putney debates. It's a very early 19th century bridge, and that's where the university boat race begins on Palm Sunday each year.